All right. Well, we have reached the point of death, the death of this dense physical body, and we're going through the whole cycle of rebirth. And we have mentioned that the death is one of the special points on the cycle. And one of the main reasons why it is special is as far as we can go into materiality. One has done as much as one can to transmute matter and materials into soul stuff and eventually into spirit. So at this point, the spirit lets go. And for some people, that's not a happy thing. And it should be mentioned that there is no disgrace in letting go. If a person has done as much as can be done, there is satisfaction and other positive feelings, and there is even a relief because one has done as much as one can. And then there's always the recognition that you'll get another chance to do better. This is what's nice about the whole idea of rebirth. In the spiritual life, accurate self-judgment is very important. You start developing and going into the inner worlds, it becomes critical. So when we can see our limits, and we can see the limits of the world and what it's all about, that's good judgment. And when you say, now is the time for me to go, that's wise. It's only the undeveloped and pernicious people that hang around and bother mediums and other people who are susceptible to their influences. There is no shame in death, and the only thing that comes close to being a shame in death is to not have given oneself to life as well as one can every day. That's why some people want to hang on, because they know they haven't given themselves as well as they can. Now, at the letting go, things change very radically for the individual. The backward looking that has increased throughout life occupies the complete experience of the individual immediately after death. However, this looking back or this retrospection is different than when it was during lifetime. Comparatively speaking, right after death, it is involuntary and it's uncontrolled. It is not just looking back out of interest or even at will. It just happens, and it just happens to everyone. Now, it's not unreasonable to consider this something analogous to winding an old wind-up clock. We, the spiritual beings, have literally wound ourselves or screwed ourselves or drilled ourselves or knitted ourselves into this world, whether we realize it or not. So the forward-looking life that we experience here is only a superficial manifestation of the creative expression of the Spirit. That works through the archetype that truly spins everything forward. It's an act of creation, or it's an act of experiment. the will to create, which is commonly called the will to live, which is a misnomer because in spirit we live anyway. But the will to create dissolves everything back into chaos when it is done. Even in life, we say of some people that they have let go of themselves. And when they do, they start slipping into chaos, or into decadence is usually probably the better word. Now, the universal principle of analogy applies to this activity. It applies in the macrocosm and in the microcosm. So when great spiritual teachers say that if the universal spirit were to suspend the will to create for one moment, things would dissolve back into chaos, is perfectly true. Now we got to correct. A few minutes ago we said that the unwinding is involuntary and uncontrolled. The involuntary part is certain, but the uncontrolled part needs a little bit of adjustment. Now, for most people who have never practiced any kind of spiritual exercise and who do not understand what's happening to them and why it is happening to them, it is virtually, if not definitely, uncontrolled. However, if an individual has sufficient soul power from having done service and has performed spiritual exercises to gain control, spiritual self-control, the process and the activity can be modestly controlled. Now, there's irony in this, because the exercise that makes one most fit to control this unwinding is called retrospection. Retrospection is an exercise to do at least some of the unwinding while you're in the body alive. It is usually done just before you retire at the end of your day, and one reviews all of the events of the day and retrieves especially the moral essence of behavior or misbehavior. And it is a kind of hyper looking back to special effect. It probably, in my experience, the greatest steps I have taken forward in spiritual awareness and awakening have taken place during the times that I have done the most retrospection. And when it is said that it is the most powerful of all public exercises, as far as I'm concerned, that is true. However, anyone who has ever tried getting all of the records of the events of the day in reverse order realizes that it is exceedingly difficult, especially if you try to get the etheric records where the pictures are live and real. Rudolf Steiner has said about this that in order to perform the retrospection exercise, it requires a great deal of love and sacrifice to put in all of the effort to do that. Calling up these records requires will, and it requires intent. For almost any ordinary person like ourselves, it is a glacially slow process. In fact, sometimes it feels like you're trying to reverse the flow of a glacier, because everything in life wants to go forward, and when you're trying to make things go backward, the viscosity of what normally happens in etheric experience becomes so heavy that it almost proves impossible. Now, for people who have practiced a lot of this in rebirth, or for people who do a lot of visual work or memory work, it becomes easier. Some people, there are people they have them usually on the edges of town. They have these memory seminars where they teach you how to be in a room of 50 people and within an hour's time be able to tell you the name of each of those 50 people because they give you exercises for practicing memory. And it's the same thing with getting in touch with this true memory. We have a promise about this. Both Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner have said that it gets easier and faster and more thorough the more you practice. The irony in this is that those who have worked arduously at this very slow process are the most capable when the semi-uncontrolled process is whipping by really fast. The object of control in this activity, right immediately after death, is to slow down what is happening to you. In order to understand why it is desirable to slow down, we have to understand more clearly what is going on and what has been going on, which means now we're in for our side trip. To understand exactly what happens at the time of death, immediately after death, to the consciousness immediately after death, it is necessary to understand the chief characteristics of the etheric subdivision of the physical world. Not all of them, but some of the most important ones. And we want to do this in both macrocosm and microcosm. We are participating in a gigantic cosmic creation. It's not a random creation. It has an internal evolutionary structure. Like all creations, it is a manifestation of creative love. As we know from experience, what we are in is live and real, and it is much more so that than most people can believe at this point. Now, one of the things that keeps the creation, at least here in the material world, that keeps it real is novelty or newness. Not in the trivial sense of these words, but in something much deeper. Things that are new are unprecedented. It means that they have never been before. They may have been in some state or form of potential, but not in actual. This means that there are unknowns and a general unknown. Now, unknowns are fascinating and engaging for anybody who has any curiosity at all. Things that are unknown seem to draw us in. And when encountering that, we feel exactly like Goethe said, there is an eternal feminine that is leading us on. And that eternal feminine is like a womb of unknown. Unknowns are filled with possibilities. Possibilities for new, good things, new beings. Now, this whole process is very much like a human creation. Did I start? Yeah, I did start that. The Creator is filled with love or with beauty and a sense of purpose which it would love to share. One never creates for oneself alone. even if it's in vanity you create for others. Now, in a dangerously simplified statement, it is said by the spiritual adepts to go something like what follows. Now, when I state all of this, please remember that this is extremely stripped down. It's very abbreviated, and a lot is left out. We will describe the creation in the state that it is now, the cosmos at present. And that's a valid thing to do if you know what you're doing, because by the principle of analogy, you get something of a sense of the whole picture. Madame Blavatsky says that the evolution that is studied by scientists is like taking 1 inch out of the middle of a yardstick. It's divided into definite periods, just like the whole yardstick is divided into definite periods. And so the principle of analogy does work. The creator gets an impulse of creative love, which is a different kind of newness. The creator in spirit is constantly outpouring a love and newness. This creative impulse becomes an idea. And in pondering over the idea, there is the urge to realize that idea, to make it manifest. This means it has to be differentiated from potential, and it has to be differentiated from the unreal. That's what realization means. It means making it real. The unreal is the unknown. The same unknown that gives unprecedented reality. There's a lot of little nuances in the basics of creation that are lovely. Between the known and the unknown, there are various grades of knowledge and ignorance. These grades of knowledge and ignorance, sort of as an interface between them, are states of more or less authentic existence. Now, the mystics who function in them call these states spiritual worlds. They range all the way from pure spirit, which is totally internal and abstract, to whatever state of concretion called matter is possible, leading all the way to outright unknown things, or the outright unknown. The creative idea is materialized, or it is realized through creation in the unknown, in the matter, going as deep into ignorance as possible. In this process, this evolutionary creation, the unknown becomes known as the creative idea is realized. Now, in microcosmic analogy, it's not much different than a painter having the inspiration, or a historical novelist getting the inspiration for a new historical novel and manifesting it in either a painting or a novel. When you do that, it never comes out as you intended. And in the struggle, all kinds of valuable experiences gained, and there's all kinds of education that takes place in the process. It is very important that it never comes out as it was intended. If it did, If our imagination was the reality, it wouldn't be real. Reality fights back. And the fighting back of reality is what gives it life. You can't say it fights back, that's too active. It has passive resistance that is ultimate. So if it was exactly what we wanted, there wouldn't be anything new learned in it. It would be a stale replication. It would have that quality that we like to call phoniness about it. In the cosmic creation, the idea is manifest first as a concrete thought, a thought which will be behind all of the creation. And when the creative idea matures through passing through a state of thought, it takes on color. And that color is the outward expression of feeling and emotion, that the experience has matured that much. Now, since the goal is as complete of a manifestation as is possible, much of the manifestation of color is desire. Desire for a more satisfying experience than now exists. The most complete manifestation, at least as far as we humans are concerned, is in chemical matter. It is in the physical world. The chemical region of the physical world is the realm of the greatest ignorance. It is the closest to the unknown. The resistance, that very passive resistance of the unknown, is experienced as limitation. So this world that we're focused in now is the realm of greatest limitation. And there's a lot of value to that, but we don't have time to go into that. By the time that one proceeds all the way down to the solids, it is virtually static resistance, which is with as much limitation as possible. Or as Hamlet would say, there's the rub. In order for the creative impulse to enter this limited and resistant world, there has to be an energetic agency. And that agency is called in mysticism the etheric subdivision of the physical world. The ethers have many functions, but pertinent to our discussion is the agency of the etheric subdivision to carry life and energy into and out of this relatively inert Christian chemical subdivision. And it's in this function of carrying energy in and out of the physical world that is most pertinent to what we want to get at as far as death is concerned. Now, as I understand it, in macrocosm, the entire physical world is a product of the desire world. You might say that each of the successive worlds that are more material is a product of the world before it. Desire is object-oriented, and the physical world is its object and its objective. It is needed for desire fulfillment. Of course, this has to be seen in terms of the evolutionary creation that we just spoke of. In saying that, it must be clarified that the physical world is not an extension of the desire world. It's an entirely different world with different laws and different principles. desire seeks completion outside of itself. The physical world, in both the etheric and the chemical subdivisions, is outside of the desire world, even though it's interpenetrated by the desire world. Seeing things in a desire world, you know you're seeing a different world than what you're seeing with your eyes. The physical world, especially the chemical subdivision, is the outer world of our solar cosmos. It's so outer that it only has outsides. If you take any object in it and try to open it up, all you get is another outside. You don't get that same withinness that you get with inner perception. The cosmological relationship of the physical world to the desire world is a resonant relationship. The manifestation of all of the worlds of the universal spirit is a resonance. Tim will sometimes tell us about that, since he knows about all those resonances. This is an extremely deep subject, which hopefully we'll be able to treat at another time when we get to cosmogony, if I'm fortunate enough to live that long. Anyway, the physical world and everything in the physical world is a product of that resonance from the desire world. There is a profound mystery in this if we look at this in terms of reflective projection. If we look at it in the spirit that is reflected into the physical world, there's a profound mystery, but we don't have time to go into that either. This is a talk that's filled with teasers. That's the third one already. I think there's one more in here. In the cosmological activity of manifestation, from the almost exclusively inner worlds to the exclusively outer world, in the chemical subdivision of the physical world, the ethers are the medium of manifestation. The ethers have inwardness as well as outwardness. And you remember when we talked about cosmography, we said that the ethers were all polarized, and polarized for that very reason. So, things coming into and passing out of chemicals do so by the ethers. Now, the ethers are more vital and energetically fluid than the chemicals, even more so than the gases. Now, within all realms, there is both life and form. But the more one proceeds inward to the higher worlds, the more predominant the inwardness is. The forms in the desire world, because of their withinness and their not needing distinction, are much more nebulous. They're much less discrete than the things that we see around us here in the physical world. And they only become clarified and distinctified when we approach them with our materialistic consciousness. So therefore, when you see all these hallucinations in the desire world of forms and figures that have really bizarre things, the inside of them is something much different. And the form that is tacked on to the outside of them, so to speak, is a consequence of our material consciousness here. The gods don't make machines with gears and levers, or they don't make Egyptian hairstyles. Nevertheless, the goal is definite, objective completion in the realm of forms by limitation. That's what we see all around us. Now, thus, as things pass through the ethers outward into the consolidated chemicals, the things that are passing through the ethers become defined. They become distinctified, and that is part of the way things work in the ethers, is to bring them into something like we see in this world. Now, in order for that to happen, much of the mood and of the feeling from the desire world is sacrificed. It's sacrificed to obtain form, because this is a world of form, just the way the desire world is a world of color. So, speaking very roughly, the physical world, especially the chemical subdivision, is a condensation. And even gas or a cloud or something like that is something very definite. Now, this condensation occurs in the macrocosm when the chemical planets are formed out of the highly energetic etheric nebula. All of the planets began as whirlpools and then condensed in them. It happens in the microcosm through every living being that lives in the chemicals. And to some extent, even the chemicals themselves, through the elements, are formed or changed. In any case, the forms inert or inherent in the ethers exist before and after final concrete manifestation. So as these things are coming from nebulous desires to becoming quickened forms, to becoming concrete forms, and then the experience of them is finished in concretion, all of that remains alive in the ethers. That's because the ethers have an inherent longevity. It's another principle that we won't have time to go into. They have an inherent longevity that is not the same as it is here in the physical world. To say it quickly or briefly, the etheric world will live long after the chemical world has dissolved. Now, there are some significant differences in this. There's a difference in an etheric manifestation after it has completed its stay in chemical world, or has brought about in the chemical world what it's trying to bring about. But that difference is not as dramatic as one might think. So it happens that very often that undeveloped clairvoyants speak about remembering the future. That is, things that are coming into the chemical state through the ethers. And sometimes some tyros can't even tell the difference between the future and the past. Though if you're savvy, you can. Our friend Millie, who just passed on, was focused in the ethers, and she said, I can see the future. She knew she was going, and she did. All right. For a side note, all of this sounds tremendously fatalistic. But that's not true. That even though things have a long spiritual history behind them before they become manifest, and they are already becoming manifest through the ethers, does not mean that things cannot be changed. However, it is much wiser to catch them when they are in thought, for example, or even before they become thoughts, than to try to change things at the etheric level before they become manifest in the chemicals. To change things when they are already becoming manifest in the chemical is to thwart a creative process and not modify it, which is why abortion is such an abominable activity. Significant improvement in our humanity will not come until we start taking control of our thoughts and desires and catching things before they're out of hand. A lot of the changes that we try to make here in the world, politically or religiously or things like that, if we haven't changed ourselves and can get at the creative thought forms, are sort of like children shuffling blocks around. They don't have much more importance than that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to improve things here, but we can't hope for the improvements to really stick unless we can get them at a level of creativity that is more primordial or more original. Another difference is that emotions, feelings, and desires that are shed in order to produce the physical objects are still around to some extent in the ethers. So, if you start recalling events from the ethers, you realize very quickly that quite a bit of the original attitude environment is in that etheric record. So they are living memories much more than we would ever believe or they would ever think now. Now, since we're speaking about the human cycle of rebirth, we'll again limit ourselves to the microcosmic etheric manifestation. Some people call it a personal memory of nature. Some people call it a personal panorama. Now, our vital body is our vital body is an endurance in everything that has become manifest in our physical body. Both our inner impulses and our external sensory experiences are carried through and kept in the ethers. As we said just a few minutes ago, the transactions between worlds are resonant. Thus, the impingement or the impression on the ethers is also resonant. And this is true even between the ethers and the chemicals. And that's another subject that's too long to go into. There's so many of these things. I started making these notes, and the big part of making the notes is trying to rein myself in, because I'd like to go on side trip after side trip, and then everything would be lost in some kind of chaos. In short, since the gases are the most subtle chemicals, and the closest to the ethers, there is a sensitivity or a resonance between gases and the ethers. And this closeness and this resonance is so subtle that the early investigators, such as many of the alchemists, didn't always distinguish between gases and ethers. So the things in the desire world and the higher world are found more readily in the gases than they are in the liquids, and certainly in the solids. Now, there's a folk recognition of this. Right in our language, we say, there's a feeling in the air. or we say that someone has an air of death about them. We say that it's in the air. Now, because of this, every time we take a breath, we carry an etheric impression of everything in the environment, even things of which we may not have been consciously aware. We said in the talk previous to this that we had a lovely time taking a walk in the woods, but there was so much in that experience that we weren't aware of, which we would not be able to appreciate and utilize in our being until some very distant time in the future. And it's like that with our daily existence. There's a lot of experience that we're completely unaware of. Now, these impressions, which some call images, neither word is really a good word, are carried through the etheric component of the blood. And they pass to every cell and every atom in our body. And they become part of an etheric experience of our life that is stored at the negative pole of the reflecting ether of our bodies. And so we carry around, I don't want to say these pictures, but these vital experiences, because you don't have to worry about dimensionality. You don't have to worry that your atoms are going to be too full or something like that. Is carried around with us during life. And this is all important. It's all important to us for our own evolution. It's all important for what we have to offer the divine as a consequence of our life. So everything that happens in the physical world is recorded. Everything. Now that is the all-important experience that we mentioned earlier that must be harvested, and that nothing, if possible, should be lost. So, what happens at death is a great unwinding. One's consciousness is focused in the ethers, mostly, much more than in the physical, and like all unwinding, the unspinning goes the opposite direction from the original winding. It's so we experience that every day, that kind of phenomenon, dressing and undressing. The things that we put on last are the things that we put on first in the morning. Thus one sees one's life backwards, in reverse order in terms of time. Now, to not be personal, I can mention that I have two friends who have had near-death experiences from drowning. And in conversations with both of them, they marveled at how clear it all was. One of the two people thought I was crazy and especially disliked anything I would say politically. But if I'd start talking about these sorts of things, he couldn't help himself from listening to it and really getting turned on by it. And I was sort of an unpleasant experience for him. The other fella was more astute. He related to me how every feeling that had occurred to him previously in life was there. And to him, that was more important than just the images that were like this world. And that fella went on to have a glowing spiritual life. It really changed him. Now, death does not completely end the awareness of things here in the physical world. because one is focused mostly in the ethers doesn't mean that one isn't aware of things that are felt in the chemicals. Now, the experience in the ethers is not as clear as in the senses, but things that are happening here can distract one from viewing the panorama. So, if we here in the physical, and we're strong here because we're anchored, if we here start directing things toward the person who is newly deceased, that's disruptive. That person is not harvesting things. And for this reason, one should never mourn or grieve or wail or do all of those things, because that becomes a distraction, especially if it's directed at the person who's trying to focus on something else. The best situation for the corpse is to put it in a cool, quiet place like a morgue. People think of a morgue as a dreadful place, but for this it's very good. The reason why it should be cool is because otherwise there might be rotting of the physical before all of the experience is completed inwardly. Now, it's not the same thing as when one lives in the body, but there is a resonant relationship between the ethers and the physical body, the corpse. A small scale example of this resonance is the phantom limb effect. If you lose an arm or something like that, and then somebody takes that arm that's away from your body and maybe on the other side of town, and it starts hammering that, you feel it. And that's not in the brain, that's because there is an etheric resonance between the physical and the etheric. So because of this extreme distraction through resonance from the physical body should be at all costs avoided. And for this reason, organ harvesting, post-mortem examinations, embalmings, and all those kinds of terrible practices are to be avoided. They're mostly materialistic anyway. Now we're talking about spiritual stuff. We're talking about stuff that matters, that counts. Was your life worth something, and are you saving what it was worth? Now, when the unwinding is complete, you can do whatever you want with the corpse. Probably burning it is the best thing to do, because there's nothing personal left behind toward which you might be attracted. This is just the opposite of the way it is with the Native Americans. The Native Americans wanted to stay here, and they were buried with personal objects that had their etheric flux on them so that they could draw off that flux and be a little bit more potent in the lower realms. Now the question always arises, when is the unwinding done? If you're clairvoyant, it's no problem. It's a simple matter of observation. Otherwise, it's a matter of intuition. And if your intuition is not developed well, or you don't trust yourself with it, it's best to play it safe. The duration of the unwinding can last from a few seconds to 3.5 days. The 3.5 day maximum is an analogical echo from our evolutionary past which we also don't have time to go into. One reason for the short durations is extreme depletion of the vital body. It has no oomph left in it. It just lets go really quickly. Loss of attention can shorten the span of observation. We've all had that where we're doing a process and we lose attention and it slips away from us and runs out of control. Hopefully it's not in the car, but we've all had that happen. And that will happen with the panorama also. The focus of attention and control of the process are extremely important. So those few days or few hours immediately after death are extremely important. Earlier we said that we cannot stop the unwinding, but we can control it, and we can control it by slowing it down. And the slowing down is not like stepping on a brake pedal or something like that. It is like paying close attention. If you're playing a piece of music and you pay close attention to what you're playing, everything seems to slow down and there's plenty of time to get from one note to the next. And something like that is the way it works with looking at the personal panorama. If one has practiced spiritual exercises, especially the retrospection exercise, one can slow it down very much and take everything in intently. And that is the goal. Because all of your future existence depends on whether you can reap the experience that you've had here. You may have had a very rich life here, but if you can't carry it into the inner worlds, that's kind of sad. It isn't lost completely. There are other places where you can get the essence of all of that experience, but it's a long, long time before we will be evolved enough to derive it that way. All right, there's a lot more to be said on this topic, and it'll be the first part of the next talk. That's about all I have for tonight. Questions? Yes.
You refer to when you're creating something and you unknow it and it becomes known, and then you said you used the phrase something about ignorance.
About the what?
About ignorance.
Yes.
To me, ignorance is the wrong word. It implies that it's something that you should know, that,
Yeah.
and the only word I can think of in its stead would be unknowingness.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. Anybody else? Yes.
So for people who are less spiritual or not spiritual at all, the process after death happens so quickly and in an uncontrolled way, they are not able to harvest as much?
If they were in an extremely weakened state, that'll have it go quickly. And if they're not paying attention, it runs away on you. But most people are fascinated, and it's sort of a trance-like existence. Because most people, trance is an etheric state, just as shock is an etheric state, where you're focused more in those inner worlds than in the physical. And some people are just not at home in that. And this is why the more we can share of this with people, the more we can help the progress of humanity.
And people who are cremated right away, like in India, they have...
Sad, very sad thing, very sad thing. We have all sorts of practices that are based on religion and that are not based on the knowledge of the spiritual worlds, and because of that, we do a lot of harm to ourselves. This is why, this time using the word the way Jerry would like it, this is why ignorance is such a pernicious thing, because if we knew better, we wouldn't do these. We wouldn't do these things. And that, in some cases, it used to be that if, especially with a male, if a male died and they burned him up, the wife had to be burned with him. Yeah.
So you said if a person's very weakened, do you mean their body? Or?
Their vital body, yes. Now, I can't verify this myself, but on very good authorities of both Max Heindel and Rudolf Steiner, who I think are very good authorities, supposedly when you fall asleep, at the moment of falling asleep, you very rapidly go through your past day. And I know that once you go to sleep and then you come back to a waking state and try to retrospect in, it's a totally different ball game. It's different all the way around. Max Heindel says, though, if you do the conscious retrospection before you go to sleep, then you carry that over with you when it's taking place after you have left your body. And you get much more than if you had just gone to sleep without having done any retrospection or anything like that.
It's been about 20 years, but I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Oh, yeah.
Not all of it, but it was interesting that when someone died, a monk came and never left that body for 3 days at least. And it was interesting. I was trying to follow it, with a Western mind, but the monk would be heard to say, "No, don't go there. Don't do that. Stay here." And I was thinking about that because if you're trying to, a lot of people try to escape it.
Yes. There are, in the south of Spain, there are professional retrospectors. And they know that somebody is close to death. They're usually all little old women, and they go around the bed and then they reminisce with the person. They say, "Remember when you did that?" And then they all laugh together, and they try to, they remember the events of the person's life, and they help them bring it before leaving the physical body. And I have a friend that did that very thing, not quite like the Tibetan with that knowledge of what was going on in the inner worlds, but she belonged to a wealthy family, and when her mother died, there wasn't anybody that wanted to handle the body the way she did, and so she had a casket and she filled it up with ice, and she sat next to the casket silently for 3 days while her mother was processing. And she couldn't have given her mother a better present. Not enough.
Even in America, not that long ago, I have read books of pioneer Americans and early Americans. There was always somebody with the body after death. They did not leave it unattended. Somebody took a turn of staying with the body.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't understand the implications, but...
Sometimes we get intuitions to do things that are right things to do without having to have all kinds of occult knowledge or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Orthodox Jews, somebody has to sit with the body, and there's no cremation. That's a pose, but they bury the person as quickly as they can.
Yeah, that's a mistake.
But the person can still gather up their stuff.
In a few lifetimes on.
Oh.
Only when they can get the memory of nature out of the world of thought, because that's not lost, it's still there. What happens to people who have untimely deaths are greatly distracted, especially if they had a lot of moral things that they learned in this life. that they wouldn't have otherwise, rather than let them slip behind in the ongoing stream of evolution. They die as children. And when they die as children, then they are given object lessons in morality. But we'll be talking about that in a few weeks. And so they get a makeup, which is virtually what they would have learned, but certainly not near as much as from the experience itself.
So if people are buried right away, like Orthodox Jews will do, how does that interfere with just because there's a ceremony and all that is distracting, or?
If they burn right away, the records are lost.
Bury.
Yeah.
Not burned, buried.
Oh, buried. No, that might not interfere at all,
Okay.
provided they don't embalm.
No, that's supposed to.
Okay.
Cremation, embalming, all of that is not
Okay.
permitted.
Yeah, that's not bad.
I'm not willing to accept that all the Indians, with all the massive amount of knowledge they have in these matters, that they've been making a serious mistake all along. I'm sorry.
Well, you can look it up in the inner worlds when you're out at night. Ask Amma whether you can look at that and bring it back. These are talks as well as I understand nature, and I'm trying to make it as...
I just don't believe that the hierarchies, after all the work they put into us, would allow us to just let millions of lives just go unaccounted for.
I
I
agree
just
with
don't.
that.
I just don't. That's
There
like,
must be something
Christians
going on
having to
there.
believe that everyone goes to hell who's not a Christian. It's just,
Yeah.
I don't believe it.
Yeah. Well, they
Something else
allowed
going on.
many millions of Jews to be killed at Auschwitz. The hierarchies did. And how much freedom we have and how much they impose their will on us, that's a difficult question.
Aldo Leopold died in a field burn. He had a heart attack and they were burning the field. He died, burned up immediately. That wasn't his doing. I mean,
He probably had some kind of destiny like that. Like some authors give examples of people who die in, like that nightclub in Florida where people are burned, where the club is burned beneath, and they are people that in past lives, like if you read, for example, Caesar's Gallic Wars, he talks about if they couldn't get a city to surrender, they just surrounded it and burned them out. And then the people that participated in that, willfully participated in that, in their next life, they have that kind of experience, dying in a theater, a fire or something of that order. Good. Thank you very much. It's been a fun night.